So generally, it'll just be kind of to chop off the first 15 seconds or so, whenever. Whenever we're talking nonsense, basically. It doesn't happen often.
Doesn't, no. At least you don't.
No comment.
Are we ready to go?
I think so.
Are we recording?
Yes.
Hey Johnny, how are you? You good?
Very well, Kieran. How are you?
Grand. Great to be with you again for a second one of these podcasts where we try to discuss a little bit about some of the questions that some of our listeners have sent in.
Yeah.
And
Series 7.
It's Series 7 we're on now. Wow. Okay.
Who ever thought we would make it this far?
Indeed. And more and more people, thankfully, are joining, and they discover it, and then they go and listen to all the series up to this point.
I forgot who had the most.
Who had the most what?
Yeah, you talk. I'll at some point update listeners on the episode numbers.
Oh, you can, yeah. So
we even had some guests. You were saying so you were away teaching a number of weeks ago.
I was teaching there last week,
and
I directed the class to the podcast, and it's interesting that they found them very useful. In fact, when I was saying goodbye to some of them to come away and fly back to Belfast, they saluted me with grace and peace.
So our final blessing and
final blessing.
Really. That's good.
So in this series 7, what we're trying to do is respond to some questions that have been sent in by some of our listeners.
Yep.
And a few people have sent in a question in various different ways that cluster around a question that one particular listener has sent in. Not sure of what his name was it Mihal or not? I'm not sure. But you might just read out the question and we get into our conversation.
Certainly. So Mihal writes, I was there in person to hear you, and he's directing this to me because I assume he hears you all the time.
Yeah.
I was there in person to hear you, Johnny, at the Novena in Clonard, and I've been privileged to hear a number of Presbyterian ministers there over the years. Why, however, do so few come to preach, and why do you? Is there a reaction to you doing this? And that's from Mihal. So he's obviously a member of Clonard or someone who comes to Clonard.
Or maybe the online community there,
Yeah, quite possibly. And heard a number of Presbyterian ministers, and of course there are others. So you have more than just Presbyterian ministers.
We've had Methodists over the time. We've had Church of Ireland.
Even at this Novena had some lay people.
We did some lay Catholics, some women preachers. It's the only opportunity that we're able to provide where some women come and preach. I think generally they're massively welcomed, though there will be one or two critics always.
Yeah, of all of us, I'm sure. Even you get the occasional critic, as well, but we'll not talk about those. So Mihal asks, why are there so few? He specifically talks about the Presbyterian ministers, so there will be the likes of Steve Stockman, who has done recent novenas as well.
Ivan Steen
did one recently, Ken Newell, of course, will have done them over the years, along with many others, including some Presbyterian ministers.
And some women Presbyterian ministers too.
True, sorry. So there have been a number, but it's a smallish number.
Yeah.
If you probably, and I'm sure if you went through the history books of Clonard and the novenas and saw who had all preached, even at the end of church days and the likes, it will be a small number of Presbyterian ministers. And of course, there are over 550, I think, congregations within the Presbyterian Church and spread throughout the island. And there is a diverse group of ministers. I was wondering what the correct word would be used to describe them. I was thinking a flock, but that's not right. There's such diversity within the Presbyterian Church as a whole. So, following the kind of island of Ireland, north and south, there's a diversity of people within it. And so the Presbyterian Church follows that. And there are lots of little clusters of them. The amount of Presbyterian churches, although in Ireland, as an island, and that's what we're called, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, the majority of those are clustered within Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
There are very few. I remember talking to someone recently, and they're presbytery, which is what the Presbyterian Church is grouped into. So there are smaller presbyteries, which are groups of Presbyterian churches. Here in East Belfast, we have 15, 16 plus within a small geographical distance. When you go down further to the south, you might have hundreds of miles between two neighbouring churches, and the further you go, the further south and the further west, that's certainly the case. So there is a geographical bent towards Northern Ireland, but there are lots of Presbyterian churches within small areas, and even within East Belfast we have a large number. I was an assistant minister in Newtonards in Northern Ireland, just out kind of 10 miles outside Belfast, and within it you could throw a stone and hit 7 Presbyterian churches in a small town. And if we were to look into the history of all of them, there have been various fallings out, there have been various divisions, there have been disunity, there have been reasons in which there's a first Presbyterian church in Newtonards, there's a second Presbyterian church in Newtonards, there's a Regent Street, there's a Greenwell Street. There are all of these churches, and that's maybe where our system, compared to the likes of the Catholic system, allows these churches to pop up all over the place, or allows people to open churches, or throughout the years and throughout the history of the church has allowed these churches to spread, but in the bad sense of spreading, in that they have fallen out in divisions. And that's probably in our history. John Dunlop, who's a former moderator, wrote a book about precarious belongings, and there's a sense in which the Presbyterian history and culture and identity is one of dissent, and one where we don't agree well. There's a dissent, there's a distrust, there's all of that bred into the Presbyterian identity. And so if I didn't agree with you in the Presbyterian church, I would go and start my own. Or if I didn't agree with some theological point, then we wouldn't necessarily feel that we were able to worship together. And so within that identity, there's a lot of division and disunity, and reasons, some legitimate, some not, that people have gone and started different churches. So that kind of history of the Presbyterian church is there, and probably forms a lot of why it is and why people wouldn't necessarily come to the likes of Clonard. For me, living in the North Coast and being brought up in the North Coast, there were of course many Presbyterian churches, but all of them seemed to work quite well together. They all seemed, certainly in the church that I grew up in, there seemed to be a kind of harmony with, and a unity with other churches in the local area of who weren't Presbyterian, who were Church of Ireland, Methodist, Roman Catholic, all the various faith traditions. And so there was a sense in which, growing up and you saw that, I just assumed that's what happened. And when you come to experience other parts of Northern Ireland and see that that isn't the case, I find that a little bit strange, to be honest.
I think what you just said there, though, about the Presbyterian church, you could say about the Christian church on the wider scale. That the history of the Christian church has been exactly the same, of splits and disagreements and excommunications and reformations and counter-reformations, and each group, as it splits and separates, declares itself to be the one true and everybody else not so. And so it's not just something, I think, maybe the Presbyterian church has exclusive rights over. I think the Christian church in general, I think when I came to Northern Ireland first, I couldn't understand why churches were called the First Presbyterian and the Second Presbyterian, until one day I was in a town here in Northern Ireland, but I won't say, we were preparing a service called In Joyful Hope, and that was that 4 times a year a group would meet for a Eucharist, twice in a Catholic church with a Protestant preacher and twice in a Protestant church with a Catholic preacher. And we were meeting in a Protestant church in this town, and this was the First Presbyterian church of that town. And as we were working our way through in the planning, it became very obvious, and the minister said there is no way he would have the minister from the Second Presbyterian at this service. So that's part of the story of the Presbyterian church, but I think it is the story of wider Christianity too.
And probably wider society in that same way. In that you can see in Northern Ireland especially the various divisions and the history of division within the country that breeds that mistrust amongst others. And so when it comes to any form of society living, there's that division. One of the things that I find interesting, and a phrase that stuck with me over the years, was the sin of certainty. And so this person writing declared the kind of sin of certainty, that so when we're so certain about something, when we're so believing that our way is correct, or this way is purely correct, and not allowing any room for diversion or difference, or that was essentially itself a sin. And that kind of always stuck with me, because I've never been one of those people in growing up, and maybe it's just my personality, that I've never been one of those people who assumed that I was the finished article or assumed that I knew everything. And certainly when, we've talked Bible a lot of times, and I discover new things through you and through your wisdom and understanding of the Bible, and there'll be other aspects of people around me that I'll learn. So that discipleship is always ongoing, and that student posture of learning is always ongoing. And so for me, within the Presbyterian Church, I've never assumed that the way I would do it, or the way that I believe, or my biblical understanding or my theology is perfect or right. There are lots of people who do believe that,
Absolutely,
as you pointed out, in wider society and within the Christian church. But for me personally, as opposed to other Presbyterian ministers, I have that posture of being willing and open to engage and to help understand and to deepen my own understanding by dialogue and by discussion and by friendship.
Yeah, but I think our history on this island, though, of course, has made for some of these difficulties that potent relationship between religion and politics. And with partition, I think, for those who are listening, you're eavesdropping on a conversation between two friends. So I don't feel that I have to defend any position. I'm talking to my friend here, but I think when partition came, what was essentially created were two theocracies. The Irish Free State was a Catholic theocracy, and was influenced so much by the bishops at the time, for good and for a lot of ill, as we now know. And the Northern State was very much a Protestant theocracy. And that relationship between religion and politics, I think, still has the capacity to create division and make it very difficult for the kind of relationships that we'd love to see in Northern Ireland. I think the sin of certainty that you just talked about, that strikes a chord with me. For a long time, we in the Catholic Church said there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church. So if you were not a Catholic, you were doomed to a fiery afterlife. And people said that with such certainty. The Catholic Church wouldn't say that today. Absolutely not. And then there's this thing that is practiced, I think, by Christians. But I'm subject to correction here, but it would strike me as it's probably stronger in the Reformed tradition than in the Catholic tradition, but I may be wrong on this. And that's that concept of biblical separation. That you read the Bible and you see you shouldn't have any dealings with people who are idolaters or don't believe or whatever. You keep away from them. I think there's a bit of that around, that we are the ones who are on the true path and the rest aren't, and therefore we shouldn't have engagement with them. In my experience, say from the other side, trying to ask a minister to come along and preach in Clonard, a number of things create difficulty, potentially. One is, first of all, that the preaching will be taking place in the context of the Eucharist. And we Christians are split, and we Reformed and Catholics are split on our understanding of the Eucharist. The second thing that can cause difficulty is that if you ask people to come and preach at the novena, they'll hear Novena Mary, oh dear. Steve Stockman once told me, sorry Steve for quoting you, but you told me one thing once, that 3 things Presbyterians are afraid of, in Steve Stockman's words: the crucifix, Mary and candles. Well, the Mary one. I think people have perhaps an understanding, oh, this is some kind of Marian, and it is Marian, and that can be a stumbling block. So I remember once inviting someone, having gone to his church, not a Presbyterian, having gone to his church and heard, this is a really excellent preacher. I must invite him to come and preach at the novena. And he turned me down. Right. And he turned me down because of the Marian dimension and the Eucharistic dimension to what was going on in Clonard. There's another thing that can cause difficulty for some ministers, and that is the politics of Northern Ireland, It's not exactly this, but most Catholics are thinking of United Ireland and look to Dublin, and most Protestants are thinking of the United Kingdom and look to London. And I asked a minister once, would this minister come and preach at the novena? And it took a long time to get an answer, but finally the minister said to me, I can't. The majority of my congregation are in the Orange Order. and they will not be happy if I do this.
Yeah.
And the minister had to turn down the invitation. And that is something that I've had more sympathy with over the years, that particularly in the Presbyterian church, where you are so democratic that you're accountable to your Kirk session and your elders. And if you move in a direction that your Kirk session and elders are not happy with, well, that makes for difficulties for yourselves.
Yep.
And I can understand some ministers turning it down because of that potential difficulty. We Catholics, and particularly if you're religious like the Redemptorists, we don't have that restriction.
Yeah.
And it's easier for us to engage without any difficult consequences for us, you know.
Yeah, and so that might be some of those churches where those Kirk sessions are more affiliated, or areas in which maybe in a town that is more affiliated to unionism or the BUL community, that a minister might find that difficult. And so that can be one of the reasons. The other can be, as you described, those theological reasons. But as well, I think a lot of them are wary of putting on the public show of going along. As part of a sabbatical I did a few years ago, I looked into ecumenical work and then church work, and had a lot of discussions with people, and the majority of those people that I talked to had individual relationships or crossed paths, at least in some way, with Catholic Church, with other churches, but weren't willing to publicly step out in those relationships. So may have had kind of background discussions, or we have a group here in East Belfast which meets monthly as clergy, and so we're happy to be in clergy groups, but not necessarily willing to worship, or not necessarily being willing to stand up and, as you say, tell their church that they're going to be preaching the novena in the coming year. And so there are all kinds of reasons, and so maybe to answer Mihall's questions, there's maybe a little bit of nuance for some of those ministers in accepting that invitation. And I can imagine that you, coming from the Clonard side, will also know what ministers you can ask and what ministers you can't ask.
Yeah, and if we move outside our kind of pool of those that we know, if we approach someone that hasn't preached there before, we would check out, look, is this going to put you in difficulty with your congregation? And if it is, then this is not going to fly. But if you feel that you won't be in difficulty with your congregation, then will you consider it? I think we'd be very sensitive. We wouldn't want to put anyone in difficulty with their own congregation.
Yeah. Nor would you want to put yourself as a congregation or a community in difficulty by getting someone up to preach who may not be particularly appropriate for preaching in that context or on that particular subject. One of the other sides that strikes me about it is a lot, and you'll be able to speak to it again, in terms of those people who are invited, and especially in novenas, are generally people you have some kind of relationship with, maybe not individually, but as a community.
Yeah.
And so it's people who have forged that relationship with you, whether that's by intention or whether that's by just happenstance that they have come into, whether it's through Fitzroy, whether it's through other connections. I mean, you and I became friendly through an invitation by Steve to be part of a working group in Clonard, and so that was an invitation that became a friendship that became an invitation then to come and speak. And it's the same with others. So many of the people who do speak at Clonard have that more personal friendship with you and the community.
That's right.
And certainly for Clonard, that's one of the strengths of what you do in terms of opening up those doors to have relationship and friendship with individuals, rather than just bringing along anybody for the sake of bringing someone along. So it is those people you trust and who trust you inside that relationship. So that's why I accept the invitation. I accept it because to me it's an invitation of friendship, it's an invitation of community, it's an invitation into which I'm happy to go because I trust you as a community. I'm blessed to be in a congregation that are willing to have me go and do that and be prepared to do that. And then I'm happy to go as well, because to me, the work that we do, the friendship that we have, the kind of fact that we seek to celebrate diversity through friendship is all part of that work.
It is. Can I put my cards on the table a bit and say quite honestly to our listeners, Steve Stockman came once to the Redemptorist community. We were doing a review of all our ministries, and we were reviewing the Peace and Reconciliation ministry. This is years ago. And Steve came and he gave his vision for all of that. And he said to the community, he said, this interchurch work is a minority sport. And to some extent, yes, there's a small little group of people engaged in it. And you know, not everybody supports it. So, for instance, we normally would get complaints after the novena. Some of them are just vexatious, and some of them might need you to think a little bit. We only got 2 this year, and it was interesting. One was complaining that we had women preaching.
Right.
And that we had become a fancy liberal church now where we had women preaching. The other complaint was, has Clonard now become a place to give voice to Protestant preachers? And the answer to that question is yes. Yes, it is. That's our ministry, to reach out, and that ministry has always been there in Clonard, to reach out to the other side. But they're little indicators that, it still is a minority sport in Steve's. But thankfully, the players in that minority sport are extremely dedicated. And I think in trying to reach across our divisions, be they political or religious, I really do think that we're being faithful to Jesus' prayer at the Last Supper, that they may all be one. I mean, we're really trying to forge that.
Yeah, and for some, again, you're always quick to point out the Presbyterian view of Scripture, and there is that. But again, anytime I listen or anytime we have these discussions, or even people that I listen to who would oppose the ecumenical stance, have their own bent on what that interpretation of Scripture means.
I know.
Or will use those interpretations, or sideline those. And so when Jesus talks about peacemakers and the Beatitudes, when he talks about unity in his prayer, for example, all that can be sidelined away because that's not the main issue, or that's not the most important thing. And so I think those who aren't willing to come, or those who aren't willing to engage even in the friendship side of what Clonard offer, their theology isn't willing to accept those parts of Scripture that we would see as being central to who we are called to be as disciples of Jesus. So it's even coming from that slightly different perspective and different theology about what the Bible teaches us, or what Jesus implies by those.
Yeah, I think there's an Old Testament thing operating here as well. In the Old Testament, there was a very strong thing called the Holiness Code. We're holy, they're not. We're holy, therefore we will not engage with them because they're not holy. And you set up all kinds of boundaries between the holy ones, the pure ones, and the impure ones. And I think in Jesus' day, the temple people, the Sadducees, the Pharisees were very protective of this holiness code. I mean, the Pharisees themselves, the word means separated ones. So they created, what is it to belong and what is it not to belong? And you don't engage with those who don't belong. I think Jesus came and he utterly set that aside and replaced a holiness code with what I would call a compassion code. And he was ready to reach out to people, sinners and all kinds of people who fell outside the boundaries of what the temple and the Pharisees wanted. I fear that Christian churches down through the 2 millennia have kind of, in some way, kept that kind of separation based on an Old Testament holiness code still in place. So it can be our theological differences, our political differences, they all mark the boundary between us, who are the saved and the good ones and the holy ones and the pure ones, and those who are not saved and are not the good ones and not the holy ones. And whatever about how you interpret Scripture, I really do believe that runs in the face of Jesus' vision and values. So again, I'm saying you're eavesdropping on a conversation between friends. I'm not trying to defend any dogma or doctrine here, but that's what I think. I think this kind of separation that Christians can build up, it runs in the face for me against the value and the vision of Jesus Christ.
I mean, you're so interested in your politics, and I think we have depoliticized a lot of what Jesus said. A lot of what he said in the first century was very political.
Absolutely.
And we've depoliticized it because we, as you said earlier, we try to separate that church and state. And so we take that element out of it, which is and should be very important to us now in terms of repoliticizing what Jesus said. I've heard the Good Samaritan talked about in terms of an individual personalized salvation to God, whereas I'm kind of thinking, no, it's highly politicized to these people. That's a highly political message to what Jesus was saying about that holiness code. to the people he was saying, because it was the religious he was often speaking about,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the normal people, or the everyday people who were celebrating that message, because it was so politicized at the time. So I think there's almost a way in which, because we've depoliticized it and individualized it to an individual salvation, and certainly this is more within the Protestant Church, we rip a lot of Jesus' teaching of its power to impact us in
And
that
I
way.
think we've de-radicalized it as well. That, I mean, what Jesus was doing and preaching, I mean, was a revolution. It was a religious and political revolution in his day. We've made him safe. And in making him safe, we've kind of divided ourselves from one another in our different ways of making him safe.
Yeah, we're going down a whole rabbit hole here.
Oh, yeah, we are.
Even I'm beginning to think, of that kind of the atonement and Calvary and all those ways in which Jesus becomes safe, because it's all about his death and resurrection, and actually a lot of his teachings lose their power then, because just what he was telling his disciples to do and be and become was as much an important aspect about that resurrection life as the resurrection was for that resurrection life.
Yeah. And of course, I think one of the risks too is that each one of us, we all kind of have a creation of Jesus in our own making. I mean, how I see Jesus, how I understand him, how I think what he was about, and I'm kind of very confident in my image of Jesus. But somebody else could have a very different understanding of Jesus and be equally confident. So I have to be very careful that I don't create a Jesus that suits my own personal politics or theology or whatever.
Yeah, Scott McKnight, who is an American professor, can't remember where from, I'll put it in the notes, or you can Google him. Didn't put an article up at one stage, and it was at the start of the academic year. He got all his students to write kind of an essay about who Jesus was and what their view of Jesus was, and then they did a study, kind of then write about yourself and what you're like, and they found that the two matched.
Yeah.
So as you're saying, if that person had a good sense of humor, Jesus had a good sense of humor. If that person was compassionate and looked for their version of Jesus, did exactly the same thing. So they saw there was a correlation between the two, which is exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, we could create Jesus in our own image, and maybe that's part of the split between the churches, that we churches have created Jesus and God in our own image too.
Yeah. So that diversity, that range of understandings and views of who Jesus is, carries a lot of weight, Michal, in terms of those who get involved in inter-church work and ecumenical church on a wider sense, rather than just preaching at the novena.
Well, one of the things that I must say, it is part of Clonard's ministry, and it goes way back. It goes way back into the 40s. There was always, back then it was a ministry to Protestants. I think the agenda was convert them to become Catholics. But out of that developed the various forms of interchurch ministry that are here now. And it's something in Clonard that we take pride in, that this is what we're going to do. If people aren't happy about it, well, they're not happy about it and they're entitled to their view, but we're going to do this. And personally, it has been a very exciting road for me to travel on since I came to Belfast. And we will continue to find opportunities for Protestant ministers, and maybe even Protestant people who are not ministers but who do preach in their churches, to come and proclaim the word for us in Clonard.
And certainly for me as well, it's been a very beneficial part of my ministry, and a very engaging and fulfilling part of my ministry, to be able to do that as well, and simply to widen my horizon, and the encouragement and thanks you get from people who attend those novenas are always very heartfelt and very warm. So for me, again, and I think for a lot of people, as I am greeted, as I am thanked on the way out of Clonard, see it in that wider society point of view as well. Because on the everyday streets, they engage, they work with, they socialise with, they are in the same sports clubs, their children sometimes go to the same schools. They have friendships that cross those bounds, but often the religious keeps them apart. And so they're often very encouraging in terms of they are pleased to see that people
absolutely,
are
and I think it's signalling to those who have a whole network of relationships that religion shouldn't be keeping them apart.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
Yeah. Just to finish Michal's last little bit, there is a reaction to it, and I think we've covered a lot of that in terms of the diversity. And so there'll always be, when you step outside of your tribe or when you step outside of the bounds which you're used to, whether that's in churches or social or anything else, there's always a reaction to it. But that comes with the territory, and that's why it is a minority sport. And that's why many people aren't willing to get involved in it, as Steve would say.
Yeah.
But we are, and very thankful for it.
And even these podcasts are part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's to get you who are listening to the podcast to do some thinking yourself about your connections, your attitudes, your willingness to foster relationships in a religiously and politically divided Northern Ireland.
Yeah. So I encourage you to keep doing that. Encourage you to keep asking questions and keep thinking about it all. We're trying to add a little bit of video content to it as well, so greetings to those who are on our video for the day. Our last episode we talked about the rosary, so if you have questions, I did say to Kieran I had been on Amazon to look at various forms of not only rosaries but the prayer beads that you can get for various religions. I forgot to mention actually as part of it, so I have my little wooden cross that I carry. So Ed and I got these whenever we were in Israel, and this is I suppose in the same way my kind of form, so I'll use it and I'll hold on to it whenever I'm praying. So if you don't want to go down the rosary, for you Presbyterians out there, you can get these little wooden crosses. I get this one in Israel, but you can get them online as well. And also,
they're not crucifixes.
They're not, no. You can also get, as I was telling you, a digital counter, so that whenever you're working your way through the beads, there's a little button you press and it'll count the beads that you're going through just to keep it right. So as you get on years, I'll maybe get one of those for you.
Well, Johnny, you were telling me about that, and I was thinking of the postman delivering this here at the manse. He'd be saying, "What's going on here?"
The kids would love it. They'd be counting up because it tells you the number on it. It'd be good way of counting as well. Good family activity. But so you can go on. We encourage you both in your prayer life and in your life, trying to cross some of those bounds, or trying to work alongside and make peace with those people who are beside you. But we will continue to do so.
Absolutely.
With grace and peace.
With grace and peace. God bless everyone. That was one of our better ones.
Yeah,
that was a really good one.
We covered a lot of subjects.
Oh yeah, I think people will find that one very interesting.